Napoleon conquered most of Europe, built an empire that stretched from Spain to Russia, crowned himself emperor and rewrote the laws of an entire continent. Then he died alone on a prison island, thousands of miles from home. Alexander the Great never lost a battle, but died at 32 without securing his legacy. Genghis Khan built the largest land empire in history, only to watch it fragment after his death. What's the pattern? Power without accountability always collapses, and the fall is always harder than the rise. What happens when warriors return home? The performance trap nobody talks about. Here's something that doesn't make sense at first glance. You train someone to be the ultimate weapon. You send them into the worst situations humanity can create. You tell them to do whatever it takes to survive and complete the mission. Then you bring them home and expect them to follow the same rules as everyone else. How's that supposed to work? The ancient Spartans understood this problem better than anyone. Their warriors were legendary, trained from childhood to be killing machines, disciplined beyond anything we can imagine today. But here's what most people don't know. Sparta had strict rules about when and where violence was acceptable. A Spartan warrior who killed a helot without authorization faced trial and execution. The same man who was praised for slaughtering enemies in battle could be executed for unauthorized violence at home. Why would a warrior society do this? Because they understood something profound about human psychology and social stability. Combat training doesn't just teach skills. It rewrites your threat assessment system. It changes how you perceive danger, how quickly you respond, and what level of force feels appropriate. Without clear boundaries, warriors become the greatest threat to their own society. Look at what happened after World War I. Millions of men came home after years in the trenches. They'd lived in a world where killing was survival, where following orders meant everything, and where civilian rules didn't exist. Many couldn't adjust. Some became criminals, others became revolutionaries. The rise of fascism in Europe was partly fueled by veterans who couldn't transition back to civilian life and found new outlets for their combat skills. The neurological reality is brutal. When you operate under extreme stress repeatedly, your brain creates powerful associations. Violence becomes a solution. Aggression becomes a reflex. The prefrontal cortex, the part that handles judgment and consequences, gets bypassed. You're hardwired for survival mode. That doesn't just switch off because you change locations. But society can't function if trained killers operate without constraints. This is where the rule of law becomes non-negotiable. It doesn't matter what you can do. It doesn't matter what you've done for your country. There are lines that nobody crosses. Period. The alternative is chaos. The fascinating part is how different cultures handle this transition. Some societies have rituals specifically designed to de-escalate warriors. The Maasai in Africa have ceremonies that mark the transition from warrior to elder. Ancient Romans had religious purification rites for soldiers returning from war. These weren't just symbolic. They were psychological tools to help rewire combat-trained brains for civilian life. Modern militaries are finally catching up. Programs for reintegration, therapy for PTSD, training for emotional regulation. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Even with all that support, the rule of law remains the ultimate boundary. Your trauma doesn't excuse your actions. Your skills don't grant you immunity. And that brings us to a question nobody wants to answer. Why Alexander's empire died with him? The fatal flaw in personal greatness. Let's talk about the greatest military mind in ancient history. Alexander the Great conquered the known world by age 30, never lost a battle, built an empire that stretched from Greece to India. His tactical genius is still studied in military academies today. And then he died, and his entire empire collapsed within a generation. This isn't a story about military failure. It's a story about structural failure. Alexander built everything around his personal genius. His generals were loyal to him, not to a system. His empire was held together by his charisma and his presence on the battlefield. When he died, there was no institution strong enough to maintain unity. His generals immediately started fighting each other for pieces of the empire. Compare that to Rome, which outlasted Alexander's empire by 1,000 years. Rome wasn't built around one genius. It was built around systems, laws that applied equally, institutions that functioned regardless of who was in charge, military structures that didn't require a brilliant general to be effective. When a Roman emperor died, the empire continued. When Alexander died, everything fell apart. This is the hidden truth about sustainable high performance. Individual brilliance has a shelf life. Systems outlast people. The real question isn't, can I be great? It's, can I build something that remains great after I'm gone? Think about modern companies. Apple under Steve Jobs was brilliant, but Jobs knew his mortality. He spent his final years building systems and developing leaders who could maintain Apple's culture without him. That's why Apple remained dominant after his death. Contrast that with companies where the founder is irreplaceable. When they leave or die, the company crumbles. The rule of law operates on the same principle. It's designed to outlast any individual. A president dies, but the Constitution remains. A judge retires, but precedent continues. A general falls in battle, but the chain of command holds. This isn't weakness. This is advanced engineering. Alexander made the classic mistake of exceptional people. He believed his talent was the solution. He didn't understand that talent without structure is just potential energy waiting to dissipate. The moment he was gone, that energy scattered in every direction. The uncomfortable implication for anyone pursuing excellence is this: if your success depends entirely on your presence, you haven't built anything sustainable. You've created a house of cards with yourself as the foundation. What happens when you're tired? When you're sick? When you're dead? How ancient samurai codes prove justice powers elite performance. The samurai of feudal Japan were the ultimate warriors, masters of combat, disciplined beyond imagination, bound by a code so strict that violation meant ritual suicide. But here's what's fascinating. The samurai code wasn't just about honor. It was about maintaining a functional society where the most dangerous people were also the most controlled. Bushido, the way of the warrior, included specific rules about when violence was justified. A samurai couldn't just kill someone because he was insulted. There were procedures, witnesses required, authorization needed from superiors. If a samurai killed without proper justification, even if he was technically skilled enough to get away with it, he was expected to commit seppuku to restore his honor. Why would a warrior culture create such restrictive rules for their elite fighters? Because they understood something critical. The most dangerous threat to any society isn't external enemies. It's internal chaos caused by people who have the power to harm, but no accountability for their actions. The genius of Bushido was that it made self-discipline the ultimate measure of a warrior. Any fool can learn to swing a sword. Any thug can learn to kill. But controlling yourself, knowing when not to use your skills, that's mastery. The samurai who lived longest and achieved the most weren't the most violent. They were the most controlled. This principle shows up everywhere in high-performance environments. Navy SEALs talk about violence of action, but also about strict rules of engagement. Elite surgeons have the skill to cut anywhere but follow precise protocols. Top athletes have incredible physical power, but must compete within defined boundaries. The constraint isn't weakness, it's what makes excellence sustainable. But here's where it gets psychologically interesting. The samurai code worked because consequences were personal and immediate. You violated the code. You paid with your life. There was no appeals process, no lawyers, no plea bargains, just the blade and your honor. That level of accountability creates incredible discipline. Modern society can't function that way. We have due process, appeals, proportional punishment. These are advances, not weaknesses, but they also create a gap between action and consequence that some people learn to exploit. They understand that if they're powerful enough, rich enough, or connected enough, the rules apply differently. This is where the rule of law becomes essential. It's the mechanism that tries to close that gap, to make consequences real for everyone, regardless of status. When it works, society functions. When it fails, everything breaks down, and that failure starts at the top. Type discipline in the comments, and tell me, What's one rule you follow that others think is too extreme? If you're digging this deeper at what really drives excellence, hit that like button and subscribe. Why dictators always fall. The mathematics of power and accountability. Let's end with the most important lesson from history. Every empire built on unlimited power eventually collapses. Every single one, no exceptions. And it's not because of bad luck or external enemies. It's because of internal mathematics that can't be avoided. When one person has absolute power, three things happen simultaneously. First, they make increasingly bad decisions because nobody can tell them no. Second, everyone around them starts plotting to take that power. Third, the system becomes brittle. One bad decision can shatter everything. Saddam Hussein ran Iraq with an iron fist for decades. He survived wars, uprisings, assassination attempts. He seemed invincible. Then US forces invaded, and within weeks his entire regime collapsed. Not because his military was weak, he had the fourth largest army in the world, but because his system was built on fear, not function. The moment the pressure point broke, everything fell apart instantly. Contrast that with democracies, which survive leadership failures routinely. Nixon resigned in disgrace. The United States continued. Trump lost an election and refused to concede. The system held. Boris Johnson was forced out by his own party. Britain kept functioning. The institution is stronger than any individual. This isn't just political theory, it's performance engineering. Systems that concentrate power in one point are fragile. Systems that distribute accountability are resilient. You can test this in any organization. Companies with all-powerful CEOs who face no oversight often implode spectacularly. Companies with boards, checks, and accountability mechanisms tend to survive leadership transitions. The rule of law is the technology that makes distributed accountability possible. It creates predictable consequences regardless of who you are. That predictability allows long-term planning. Long-term planning builds lasting institutions. Lasting institutions create genuine civilization. Here's the part that applies to your personal high performance. You can operate without constraints for a while. Some people build incredible success by breaking rules and ignoring boundaries. But physics always wins. The higher you rise without a foundation of accountability, the harder you fall. The true masters understand this instinctively. They build systems with internal limits, not because they're afraid, but because they're strategic. They know that sustainable excellence requires boundaries. Discipline isn't about restriction. It's about channeling power into lasting results instead of spectacular crashes. Justice isn't the enemy of power. It's the foundation that makes power durable. And maybe the real question isn't whether you can rise above the rules. It's whether you can master the game within them so completely that you never need to break them. Drop accountability in the comments and answer this. What's the biggest consequence you've ever faced for crossing a line? If this kind of deep analysis hits different for you, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to understand that gravity applies to everyone, especially those at the top. This content is for educational and personal development purposes. Historical analyses presented are based on documented events and serve as reflection on leadership principles, accountability, and high performance, not intended as legal, military, or political advice.